You used to understand people. Not perfectly, but well enough. You could read a room, sense tension, pick up on unspoken feelings. You navigated social situations with a certain ease, even when they were difficult. But somewhere along the way, that ability faded. Now conversations feel flat. You miss cues you would have caught 20 years ago. You find yourself saying the wrong thing, misreading emotions, feeling disconnected from people you've known for decades. It's not that you've become cold or uncaring. It's that your emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, understand, and respond to emotions in yourself and others, has atrophied. And nobody talks about this. Nobody warns you that emotional intelligence isn't a permanent skill you acquire in your 20s and carry forever. It's something you have to practice. And if you stop practicing, you lose it. The question is, can you get it back? Can adults who've spent decades operating on autopilot, numbing their emotions to survive stress and responsibility, rekindle the emotional intelligence they once had? The answer is yes, but not through the methods you'd expect. Not through more self-awareness exercises or emotional vocabulary list. Through something most adults dismiss as childish and irrelevant, role play. And it might be the most powerful tool you've been ignoring. Here's the paradox. You've spent your entire adult life developing expertise in understanding systems, solving problems, and managing responsibilities. You've become competent, reliable, effective. You know how to get things done. But somewhere in that process, you stopped being good at understanding people. Not because you don't care about people, but because the skills required for professional competence are different from and often opposed to the skills required for emotional intelligence. The corporate world rewards efficiency, not empathy. Problem solving, not presence. Quick decisions, not nuanced understanding. And after decades of optimizing for those professional skills, your emotional intelligence has quietly eroded. You've become fluent in transactional communication and illiterate in emotional connection. The strange thing is, you probably had more emotional intelligence when you were younger. Not because you were wiser or more mature, but because you were more emotionally engaged with life. You felt things more intensely. You paid attention to how people responded to you because social acceptance mattered more. You hadn't yet learned to suppress your emotions to appear professional. But as you aged, as responsibilities mounted, as stress became chronic, you did what everyone does. You numbed. You built emotional walls to protect yourself from burnout. You learned to compartmentalize, to push feelings aside, to focus on what needed to be done rather than how anyone felt about it. And those survival strategies worked. They helped you function, but they came at a cost. You stopped noticing the subtle shifts in someone's tone. You stopped picking up on the tension in a room. You stopped being present in conversations because your mind was already 3 steps ahead, solving the next problem. And here's where the paradox deepens. The very thing that could restore your emotional intelligence, role play, feels absurd to you. Role play is something children do, something actors do, something therapy patients do in controlled clinical settings. It's not something a competent, mature adult engages in seriously. The idea of pretending to be someone else, of acting out scenarios, of playing with emotions like they're toys, it feels ridiculous, beneath you, a waste of time. You're a serious person with serious responsibilities. You don't have time for games. But that dismissal is exactly the problem. because emotional intelligence isn't developed through intellectual analysis. It's developed through embodied practice, through actually experiencing different emotional perspectives, through feeling what it's like to be someone else, to see the world through their eyes, to inhabit their emotional reality. And role play is the most direct way to do that. But you resist it. You tell yourself that you don't need role play because you already understand emotions. You've read the books. You know what empathy is. You're aware of your feelings. At least you think you are. But awareness isn't the same as intelligence. You can know intellectually that someone is upset without being able to respond in a way that actually helps. You can recognize your own anger without understanding what's driving it or how to express it constructively. Emotional intelligence isn't just about identifying emotions. It's about navigating them skillfully. And that skill, like any skill, requires practice, not theoretical practice, actual practice. The kind where you make mistakes, adjust, try again. The kind where you step outside your habitual patterns and experiment with different ways of being. And role play creates exactly that kind of practice space. Yet the thought of engaging in role play feels humiliating. What if you're bad at it? What if you look foolish? What if you can't access the emotions required? These fears are real, but they're also revealing because they show how rigid you've become, how afraid you are of appearing incompetent, how much your identity is tied to always being in control, always knowing what to do, always performing competence. And that rigidity is precisely what's blocking your emotional intelligence. Because emotional intelligence requires flexibility. It requires being willing to not know, to fumble, to try on different perspectives and see what fits. And role play, by its very nature, creates a safe container for that kind of experimentation. It's pretend. It's not real. Which means you can fail without consequences. You can try being vulnerable, assertive, compassionate, angry, whatever emotion or perspective you've been avoiding, and see what happens. And that practice, that willingness to play, is what rebuilds the emotional range you've lost. The cruelest part of the paradox is this: the adults who need role play most are the ones most resistant to it. The people who've spent decades suppressing their emotions, who've become disconnected from their inner life, who struggle to connect with others. They're the ones who dismiss role play as childish. Meanwhile, the people who are already emotionally intelligent often engage in informal role play without calling it that. They imagine how a conversation might go before having it. They mentally rehearse difficult interactions. They practice empathy by consciously trying to see situations from other perspectives. But because they don't call it role play, because they don't formalize it, they don't realize that's what they're doing. And the people who desperately need the practice never start because they can't get past the embarrassment of the concept, so they stay stuck, emotionally flat, disconnected, wondering why relationships feel harder than they used to, never realizing that the solution is something they dismissed as ridiculous years ago. Understanding how role play rekindles emotional intelligence begins with recognizing what emotional intelligence actually is. It's not a fixed trait. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's a set of skills that can be developed, refined, and, if neglected, lost. Emotional intelligence involves 4 core capacities: perceiving emotions accurately in yourself and others, understanding what those emotions mean and where they come from, managing your own emotional responses, and using emotional information to navigate social situations effectively. And all four of these capacities require practice, not intellectual practice, but experiential practice. You have to actually feel emotions, observe them, experiment with expressing them differently, and notice the results. And that's exactly what role play provides, a structured space to practice emotional skills without the high stakes of real-world consequences. The first way role play rebuilds emotional intelligence is by forcing you to perspective take, not theoretically, but experientially. When you step into a role, whether it's playing your spouse in a conflict scenario, your colleague in a tense meeting, or even an abstract character in a situation, you have to inhabit their perspective. You have to consider what they're feeling, what they want, what they're afraid of. And this isn't passive observation. You have to embody it, speak from their viewpoint, respond as they would respond. And in doing so, something shifts. You stop seeing that person as an obstacle or a problem to solve. You start seeing them as a human being with their own emotional reality. This is the foundation of empathy, not sympathy, where you feel sorry for someone, but empathy, where you actually understand their experience from the inside. And you can't develop that kind of empathy through reading or thinking. You develop it through practice, through trying on someone else's perspective until it starts to make sense. Role play also creates a safe container for emotional experimentation. In real life, when you're angry, you probably suppress it or express it destructively. When you're vulnerable, you probably avoid it. When you're assertive, you probably feel guilty. But in role play, you can try expressing emotions differently. You can practice being assertive without aggression, vulnerable without collapsing, angry without attacking. And because it's not real, because everyone involved knows it's practice, you can afford to make mistakes. You can try something that feels uncomfortable and see what happens. And that experimentation is how you expand your emotional range. Most adults have narrowed their emotional expression to a handful of safe, socially acceptable responses. They've forgotten how to play with emotion, how to modulate it, how to express the full spectrum of what they feel. Role play gives you permission to remember. One of the most powerful aspects of role play is that it reveals your habitual patterns. When you're asked to play a role, you bring your own emotional habits into it. If you habitually avoid conflict, you'll find yourself avoiding conflict even when playing a character who shouldn't. If you habitually people please, you'll do it in role even when it doesn't fit the scenario. And that awareness, seeing your patterns play out in a context where they don't belong, is incredibly valuable. Because in real life, you justify your patterns. You tell yourself that avoiding conflict is being diplomatic, that people-pleasing is being nice. But in role play, when those patterns show up inappropriately, you can't justify them. You just see them. And seeing them clearly is the first step to changing them. Role play also trains you to read emotional cues more accurately. When you're in a role play scenario with others, you have to pay attention to their emotional signals, not just their words, but their tone, their body language, their pauses, and you have to respond in real time. There's no time to overthink. You have to trust your emotional perception and act on it. And that practice, that real-time emotional reading and responding, is exactly what's missing from most adults' lives. We spend most of our time in our heads, analyzing and planning. We don't spend enough time actually present with other people, reading their emotional state and responding to it. Role play forces that presence. It requires you to be attuned to what's happening emotionally in the moment. And the more you practice that attunement in role play, the more it carries over into your real interactions. Another benefit is that role play helps you understand the gap between your intentions and your impact. You might think you're being supportive, but when you play out the scenario, the other person experiences you as dismissive. You might think you're being clear, but they experience you as confusing. This gap between what you think you're communicating and what's actually being received is one of the biggest sources of relationship dysfunction. But in real life, people rarely tell you about this gap directly. They just withdraw, get defensive, or shut down. In role play, you can get immediate feedback. You can ask, "How did that land?" And the other person can tell you honestly without it becoming a fight. That feedback loop is how you calibrate your emotional communication, how you learn to close the gap between intention and impact. Role play is also particularly effective for practicing difficult conversations. Most adults avoid difficult conversations until they're unavoidable, and then they handle them poorly because they've never practiced. But you can role play difficult conversations. You can practice setting boundaries, expressing disappointment, asking for what you need, saying no, and you can do it over and over until you find an approach that works. Not a script to memorize, but a way of being in the conversation that feels authentic and effective. And once you've practiced it in role play, the real conversation becomes less terrifying. Not easy, but less terrifying. Because you've already lived through a version of it. You know it's possible to navigate it without collapsing or attacking. One of the unexpected benefits of role play is that it reconnects you with your own emotions. Many adults are so disconnected from their emotional life that they literally don't know what they're feeling. They can tell you they're stressed or fine, but they can't access the more nuanced emotions underneath: the disappointment, the longing, the resentment, the grief. Role play, by asking you to embody emotions, helps you reconnect with them. When you play a character who's grieving, you access your own grief. When you play someone who's angry, you touch your own anger. And that reconnection is essential, because you can't have emotional intelligence about emotions you can't feel. You can't manage what you can't access. Role play creates a bridge back to your own emotional life. It's also worth noting that role play doesn't have to be formal or structured to be effective. You don't need a therapist or a workshop. You can practice it informally. Before a difficult conversation, imagine yourself as the other person. What are they worried about? What do they need from this conversation? How might they respond to what you're planning to say? This mental role play is a form of emotional rehearsal. And it works. It prepares your nervous system for the emotional reality of the conversation instead of just the content. You can also use role play retrospectively. After a conversation that didn't go well, replay it in your mind from the other person's perspective. What were they experiencing? What did they need that you didn't provide? This isn't about self-criticism. It's about understanding. And understanding is what allows you to do better next time. Role play is also effective because it engages your whole nervous system, not just your intellect. When you physically embody a role, when you speak the words, feel the feelings, move in the way that character would move, you're creating a full-body learning experience. And that kind of learning sticks in a way that intellectual learning doesn't. You're not just thinking about empathy. You're practicing it with your body. You're not just understanding anger. You're feeling it and expressing it in a controlled way. And that embodied practice rewires your nervous system. It creates new neural pathways for emotional expression and regulation. It literally changes how your brain processes emotional information. Another important aspect is that role play helps you develop emotional flexibility. Most adults have a limited emotional repertoire. They have a few emotions they're comfortable with and a lot they avoid. But emotional intelligence requires being able to access the full range of human emotion appropriately. To be angry when anger is warranted. Vulnerable when vulnerability deepens connection. Firm when firmness is needed. Playful when playfulness lightens the mood. Role play lets you practice this flexibility. You can try being more assertive than you usually are, more gentle, more direct, more nuanced. And through that practice, you expand your emotional range. You become someone who can meet different situations with different emotional responses, rather than always responding the same way, regardless of context. Role play also teaches you that emotions are information, not truth. When you play a role, you feel the emotions of that character. But you know those emotions aren't yours. They're part of the role. And that distance, that ability to feel an emotion without being consumed by it, is crucial for emotional intelligence. It helps you understand that your emotions in real life are also information, not absolute truth. Just because you feel rejected doesn't mean you were rejected. Just because you feel angry doesn't mean someone wronged you. Emotions are signals pointing towards something that needs attention. And role play teaches you to read those signals without being overwhelmed by them. Perhaps most importantly, role play reconnects you with a capacity you had as a child but lost as an adult. The capacity to play, to experiment, to try things without needing them to be perfect. Children develop emotional intelligence through play. They pretend to be other people. They act out scenarios. They experiment with different emotions and see what happens. And in doing so, they learn how emotions work. But adults stop playing. We become serious, rigid, afraid of looking foolish. And in losing the capacity to play, we lose a primary mechanism for emotional learning. Role play gives you permission to be playful again. Not childish, but playful. To approach emotions with curiosity instead of judgment. To try things and see what happens. And that playfulness is what allows emotional intelligence to grow. When you start using role play to rebuild emotional intelligence, the first thing that changes is your conversations. They become less transactional and more human. You stop just exchanging information and start actually connecting with people. You notice subtle shifts in tone that you would have missed before. You pick up on what's not being said. You respond to the emotion underneath the words instead of just the words themselves. And people feel it. They lean in. They open up. They trust you more because you're actually present with them instead of performing competence or rushing to solutions. Your relationships deepen, not because you've become perfect at understanding people, but because you're willing to try. You practice seeing situations from your partner's perspective before reacting. You rehearse difficult conversations so they're less destructive. You experiment with expressing emotions you've been suppressing. And those small practices accumulate. Your partner feels more understood. Your friends feel more connected. Your colleagues experience you as more attuned. The distance that's been growing between you and the people in your life starts to close, not dramatically, but steadily. You also reconnect with yourself. The emotions you've been avoiding or suppressing start to feel accessible again. You can name what you're feeling with more precision. You understand where your reactions come from. You develop the ability to feel difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. And that internal connection changes everything. You stop feeling numb or disconnected from your own life. You start feeling alive again. Present, engaged. Not because your circumstances changed, but because you're no longer emotionally sleepwalking through them. Over time, you notice that you handle conflict better. Not perfectly, but better. You don't escalate as quickly. You don't shut down as easily. You can stay present even when conversations get uncomfortable. Because you've practiced. You've role-played difficult scenarios enough times that your nervous system doesn't panic when they happen in real life. And that capacity to stay emotionally present during difficulty transforms your relationships. It allows repair instead of rupture. Growth instead of stagnation. You don't have to stay emotionally disconnected. You don't have to accept that this flatness, this distance from yourself and others, is just what adulthood looks like. Emotional intelligence isn't something you either have or don't have. It's something you practice. And if you've lost it, if years of stress and responsibility have numbed you, if you've forgotten how to read people or feel your own emotions clearly, you can get it back. Not through more analysis or self-awareness exercises, through practice, through actually doing the thing that feels uncomfortable, stepping into other perspectives, experimenting with emotional expression, trying on different ways of being. Role play isn't childish. It's one of the most powerful tools for adult emotional development that exists, because it creates a space where you can practice emotional skills without real-world consequences, where you can make mistakes, adjust, try again, where you can expand your emotional range and develop flexibility, where you can see your patterns clearly and experiment with changing them. And yes, it feels awkward at first. Yes, it requires you to let go of the need to appear competent and controlled. But that awkwardness is where growth happens. That's the edge where your rigid adult self starts to soften back into someone capable of real connection. You don't need a formal workshop or a therapist to start. You can practice informally. Imagine yourself as the other person before a difficult conversation. Replay interactions from their perspective. Mentally rehearse expressing an emotion you usually suppress. These small practices accumulate. They rewire your nervous system. They rebuild the emotional intelligence you've been missing. And over time, you become someone who can navigate emotions skillfully again. Who can connect with people authentically? Who feels alive instead of numb? Not because you've solved all your problems, but because you've remembered how to be emotionally present. And that presence changes everything.